Hey everyone, welcome to KSSP Podcast. I'm Spencer,
And I'm Katie.
and today we're going to be talking about farming. That's going to kind of be our theme of the day, if you will. And with that, we're going to be discussing agriculture, and then we'll go a little bit into hydroponic farming and a little bit into organic farming. So first, we're going to start with agriculture. So, what is agriculture? Well, the word agriculture is a late Middle English adaptation of Latin agricultura from ager, field, and cultura, cultivation or growing. While agriculture usually refers to human activities, certain species of ant, termite, and beetle have been cultivating crops for up to 60 million years. Agriculture is the broad term for everything that goes into growing crops and raising animals to provide food and materials that people can use and enjoy. Farming, which involves cultivating the land and raising livestock, is one part of agriculture, which also includes plant science. The development of agriculture enabled the human population to grow many times larger than could be sustained by hunting and gathering. Farming is when people grow plants and take care of animals for food. And it was a big part of why people started to live in one place instead of moving around all the time. This allowed them to have more food than they needed, which helped cities form.
So, how long ago did we start farming? It's a great question. The history of agriculture began thousands of years ago. So, a really long time ago, about 105,000 years back, is when people started collecting wild plants for food. Then about 11,500 years ago, they started planting these plants. And animals like sheep, goats, pigs, and cows were made to live with people for food about 10,000 years ago. People in different parts of the world started growing their own plants at the same time. In recent times, big farming that only grows one kind of crop has become the main way people farm, but still around 2 billion people grow just enough food for themselves and their families. So farming started in different places all over the world, and different types of plants and animals were used for farming in at least 11 different areas. People have been eating wild grains for at least 105,000 years. A long time ago, about 23,000 years, people near the Sea of Galilee started growing crops like emmer, barley, and oats. In China, people started growing rice about 11,500 to about 6,200 years ago. And the oldest proof of rice farming was found from about 5,700 years ago. They also grew mung beans, soybeans, and azuki beans. So people in Mesopotamia started raising sheep about 13,000 to 11,000 years ago. They also started keeping cattle, which were wild animals, as pets about 10,500 years ago, in places like modern-day Turkey and Pakistan. Pigs were also raised for food in Eurasia, which includes Europe and parts of Asia, starting from when people first kept wild boars as pets about 10,500 years ago. The horse was domesticated in the Eurasian steppes around 3,500 BC. So people in South America started growing potatoes, beans, coca, and raising animals like llamas, alpacas, and guinea pigs around 10,000 to 7,000 years ago in the Andes. So in New Guinea, sugarcane and some other types of root vegetables were grown for food around 9,000 years ago. And in Africa, people in the Sahel region started growing sorghum about 7,000 years ago. People in Peru started growing cotton about 5,600 years ago, and the same thing happened in Eurasia. In a place called Mesoamerica, people turned a wild plant called tezonite into maize, so corn, about 6,000 years ago. Experts have different ideas about how farming started. By studying how people went from hunting and gathering food to farming, They found that usually started with people staying in one place more and gathering more food. This happened in places like the Natufian culture near the Levant and the early Chinese Neolithic in China. Over time, people started planting the wild plants they used to gather, and those plants eventually became the crops we grow today. All right, and about 8,000 BC, people called Sumerians started living in villages and used the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, as well as a system of canals to water their crops. They grew things like wheat, barley, lentils, onions, and fruits like dates, grapes, and figs. They used plows to plant their crops, and the first picture of a plow is from about 3000 BC. So in Egypt, people started farming along the Nile River after 10,000 BC. They grew grains like wheat and barley, as well as things like flax and papyrus. In India, people started growing wheat, barley, and jujube around 9,000 BC, and soon added sheep and goats to their farm. By around 8,000 to 6,000 BC, they were also farming cattle, sheep, and goats. Cotton was being grown in India by 5,000 to 4,000 BC, and evidence shows that people were in the Indus Valley civilization used animal-drawn plows to farm as far back as 2,500 BC. So, a long time ago in China, people started using big stores to keep food safe and grew silk. They used water to power their mills and made farming easier by using irrigation. They also developed big plows with iron parts to make farming in the land easier. This idea spread to other parts of the world. People in China started growing rice about 8,200 to 13,500 years ago near the Pearl River using wild rice. In Greece and Rome, people grew wheat, barley, and emmer, and also grew vegetables like peas, beans, and olives. They kept sheep and goats mainly for their milk. In the Americas, people grew different types of crops like squash, beans, and coca. People in the Amazon started growing coca around 3,000 years ago. The Aztecs built systems to irrigate their crops, and the Mayans used canals and raised fields to farm in swamp areas. In the Andes, people grew crops like the peanut, tomato, tobacco, and pineapple, and kept animals like llamas and guinea pigs. Native people in the east of North America grew crops like sunflowers, tobacco, and squash, and gathered wild foods like wild rice and maple sugar. In the Southwest and Pacific Northwest, they practiced a type of farming that used fire to control growth of plants. The indigenous people of North America also developed a method of planting 3 crops together called the Three Sisters, which included winter squash, maize, and beans. So indigenous Australians were thought to just be wanderers who hunted for their food, but researchers have discovered they actually used fire to help grow food and make the environment better for gathering. In the forests of New Guinea, there aren't many food plants, so early humans may have used fire to help grow the karuka fruit trees, which they ate. This helped them live as hunter-gatherers. A long time ago, the Gunditjmara and other groups in Australia started to farm eels and trap fish. This started around 5,000 years ago. People in some parts of Australia started to grow yams, native millet, and bush onions, which might mean they lived in the same place for a long time. This happened in 2 different areas of the country, one on the central west coast and one in the eastern central area. During the Middle Ages, people in Western Europe changed the way they farmed. Instead of trading with others like they did in Roman times, they focused on being able to grow enough food for themselves. The farmers lived on big pieces of land called manors, which were ruled by a lord and had a church and a priest. During the Middle Ages, Europe learned new farming techniques and got new plants from the Al-Andalus area where the Arab agricultural revolution was taking place. This helped Europe change its farming, and they were introduced to sugar, rice, cotton, and fruit trees like oranges. In 1492, Columbus started a trade between the New World and the Old World. People in the New World started growing crops like corn, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc. And people in the old world started growing crops like wheat, barley, rice, and turnips. They also started trading animals like horses, cows, sheep, and goats. And Christopher Columbus did a lot of other stuff, but we won't get into that right now. In the 1700s, people learned how to use irrigation, crop rotation, and fertilizers to grow more food. This helped a lot of people live better lives because they had enough to eat. In the 1900s, farms got really big and used machines to help grow crops. Farmers also used special chemicals to make their plants grow better and make their animals stronger. This made a lot of food for a lot of people. But using all these things can also be bad for the environment and can cause problems like water pollution, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. Some people don't like this way of farming and want to grow food in a more natural way. In the 1930s, there was a really big dust storm in America that made life very hard for farmers. No, that was the Dust Bowl, I believe.
I think so, yeah. And we may now be wondering, what do farmers produce? And with that history, kind of mentioned just various different things that farmers produce. But there are four main things that are grown on farms, which is going to be food, materials for clothing, fuels, and materials for making other things. And some foods include things like grain, vegetables, fruit, oils for cooking, meat, milk, eggs, and mushrooms, just to name a few.
So, how many people work in farming? Farming is a big job for a lot of people all over the world. More than 1/3 of all workers have jobs in farming, which is only second to jobs in the service industry. But in recent years, fewer people are working in farming, especially in countries that are still developing. This is because big companies are taking over small family farms and using machines to farm, which makes it possible to grow more crops with fewer workers. So in some countries like sub-Saharan Africa, almost half the people working on farms are women, and this number hasn't changed much in recent years. But in other countries like East and Southeast Asia, even more women are working on farms. The United Nations thinks that the way women work on farms might be changing, and they might start getting paid for their work instead of just growing food for their families. So in many rich countries, they can't find enough workers from their own country to work on farms. So they ask people from other countries to come help. In 2013, in countries like Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal, 1/3 of people working on farms were from other countries. So in the United States, more than half of the people working on farms in 2019 were from other countries. But lately, fewer people are coming from other countries to work on farms in the United States because wages are getting higher and it's becoming harder for farms to find workers. And a long time ago in Europe, most people worked on farms, but over time, fewer people started working on farms and more people started working in other jobs. Today, only about 10% of people in those countries work on farms. But in many poor countries, about 60% of workers are still working on farms, but this number is going down.
And we're just going to briefly go over a couple of advancements that have been made. So scientists and new technologies have helped farmers grow a lot more crops and raise more animals for meat, but there are concerns these methods also hurt the environment and can be harmful to animals. Using special seeds and new ways of taking care of animals has made it possible to get more food, but people are worried about the effect on animals and the environment. Some of those advancements include modern agronomy, plant breeding, agrochemicals such as pesticides and fertilizers, different technological developments, and selective breeding.
So, okay, what are the environmental concerns? Farming has a big impact on the environment and can cause problems like making the planet warmer, using up underground water, cutting down too many trees, making bacteria resistant to medicine, and polluting the air and water. So the environment can also affect farming by causing problems like making plants grow less, turning land into a desert, and making soil bad for growing crops. All these things can make it harder to grow crops. And then there's also bad gases, so a little bit about those. Farming is the biggest source of harmful chemicals that go into the environment, like bug sprays, especially the kind used on cotton plants. A report from the United Nations in 2011 said that farming was responsible for making about 13% of the bad gases that cause the earth to get warmer. These gases come from using chemicals on crops, using energy from fossil fuels, and other farming practices. So a very important person at the UN, Henning Steinfeld, says that having a lot of animals for food is causing big problems for the environment. A lot of land is used just for raising these animals, and it takes up a lot of space, almost 30% of the whole world. This also leads to lots of bad gases going into the air, making the earth warmer. These bad gases come from the animals and their waste and are worse than the gases from cars. This is also making it so that there's less land for forests and other plants, which is making it harder for animals to live. The UN thinks that if we keep doing things the way we are, the bad gases from animals will go up by 60% by 2030. 60%. Wow. That's just, yeah. Farming and taking care of animals is a big reason for greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane in the air. It can also cause the land to be unhealthy and push wild animals away from their homes. So the farming and logging industries are responsible for about 20 to 25% of the gases that are causing climate change every year. There are ways to help stop this, like making new rules to reduce the harm farming is causing to the environment.
And then we'll discuss pesticides. So, as we've mentioned, agriculture can cause problems for the environment. This can happen when farmers use things like pesticides, which are chemicals to fertilize their crops, and too much water. These things can harm wildlife and their habitats. This can also lead to soil erosion and water pollution. A study in the UK found that in 1996, the cost of these problems was about €208 per hectare. In the US, the cost was around $30 to $96 per hectare for cropland and $714 million for livestock production. This means that farming could be expensive for society. The study suggested that more should be done to reduce these costs. Farms want to grow more crops and spend less money. They can do this by using things like fertilizer and getting rid of things that hurt the crops like bugs, weeds, and diseases. Making the farm fields bigger by taking away places for animals and plants to live can also help. But using things like pesticides, which kill insects and plants, can lead to a loss of nature and different kinds of plants and animals on the farm. This can also make it harder for the farm to grow as much as it wants to. People started using more pesticides since 1950 and now use 2.5 million tons of them each year around the world. But even with all these pesticides, the amount of crops lost to pests hasn't changed much. The World Health Organization found that every year there are 3 million cases of people getting sick from pesticides and 220,000 deaths. This happens because pests can get used to the pesticides, making them less effective, which means people have to keep finding new ones. This is called the pesticide treadmill. There are some people who believe that using pesticides and farming methods that produce a lot of crops in a small area is the best way to protect the environment and prevent hunger, but others disagree. They say that there are other ways to farm that are better for the environment and don't need to use as many pesticides. One of these ways is called push-pull farming, where different plants are grown together to help protect each other from pests. And then we'll talk about disease. Climate change is causing new problems for farmers. In 2021, a disease called stem rust was found on wheat plants in France, which is a place where it had never been seen before. This is happening because the winter is not as cold as it used to be, so insects that would normally die are now surviving and multiplying.
And then with the soil, humans are changing the Earth's ecosystem by using land to grow crops and raise animals. This is called land transformation, and it's causing a lot of harm to the environment. A lot of the Earth's land has been changed by humans, and some of it is not healthy anymore. This is called land degradation. About 24% of the land on Earth is degraded, and it's mostly farmland. People use this land to grow food, but it's not as good as it used to be. Land degradation happens because of bad land management, and it's a problem for 1.5 billion people. degradation can happen because of things like cutting down too many trees, making the land too salty, or making the soil too acidic.
And then for water, when there's too much fertilizer and waste from animals in the water, it can cause lots of problems. The water can turn green and smelly, and it can harm fish and other animals. This is called eutrophication. Farmers use a lot of water to grow crops, and sometimes this takes away water from places that need it. This can cause problems like wetlands disappearing, diseases spreading, and the land becoming too salty or flooded. It's important for farmers to use water wisely so that there is enough for everyone and the environment is protected.
So, as far as energy goes, farms use energy in two main ways: by using it directly on the farm and by using it to make things they use on the farm. So, direct use on the farm includes using fuel and oil to run farm vehicles and machines. Indirect use includes making things like fertilizer, pesticides, and farm machines. A big part of indirect use is making nitrogen fertilizer, which can use a lot of energy. In the US, the amount of energy used by farms for both direct and indirect use was the highest in 1979 and has gone down since then. The food system, which includes things like making, packaging, and delivering food, uses much more energy than just agriculture. Only about 1/5 of the energy used in the food system in the US comes from agriculture.
And then plastic. So plastics are used a lot in farming, like to make crops grow better and to help use water and chemicals more efficiently. These plastics are called agri-plastics and include things like covers for greenhouses and tunnels, mulch for the soil, cloth to block sun, containers for pesticides, trays for seedlings, mesh to protect plants, and tubes for watering. The most common types of plastics used are low-density polyethylene, or LPDE, linear low-density polyethylene, or LLDPE, polypropylene, or PP, and polyvinyl chloride, or PVC. It's hard to know exactly how much plastic is used in farming. One study says it was about 6.5 million tons a year, but another study estimated it was between 7.3 million and 9 million tons in 2015. A lot of farmers use plastic mulch to help their crops grow, but the plastic can break into smaller pieces and end up in the soil. In some areas where plastic mulch has been used for over 10 years, there has been up to 260 kilograms of plastic in just 1 hectare of topsoil. This shows that using plastic mulch can lead to a lot of plastic in the soil. Agricultural plastics, like plastic covers for greenhouses, are hard to recycle because they are often mixed with other things like dirt and chemicals. Because of this, people often just throw them away in fields or burn them. This can harm the soil and release tiny plastic particles into the environment. These tiny particles can also pick up harmful chemicals and spread them around. There's also a risk that using plastic in agriculture can hurt the soil and contribute to global warming.
So let's talk a little bit about the future here. New technology can help farmers make farming better for the environment. For example, conservation tillage is a way of farming that helps to stop soil from washing away, keeps water clean, and helps store carbon. There are other methods too, like conservation agriculture, growing trees and crops together, better ways to use land for animals, keeping grassland instead of changing it, and using a type of soil called biochar. But right now, most farming in the United States is just one crop at a time, and it's hard to use sustainable methods like rotating crops with grass or hay unless the government makes rules to help the environment more. So the International Food Policy Research Institute says that using different kinds of farming technology together can have a big impact on how much food is produced. They did a study to see how 11 different technologies could change farming by 2050. They found that if these technologies were used, the number of people who don't have enough food to eat could go down by 40%. Food prices could also be lower if we make changes to the way we farm and also change the way we think about being environmentally friendly. then we should be able to grow enough food for everyone on Earth, even with the Earth's growing population and changing climate. So since the 1940s, farming has gotten a lot better and produced a lot more food. And this is mainly because farmers started using big machines, fertilizers, and chemicals to protect their crops. Most of the energy used to make this happen comes from oil. In the 1960s to the 80s, a lot of changes happened in farming all over the world. This was called the Green Revolution. The amount of wheat and rice grown increased a lot, up to 390% for wheat and 150% for rice. But using so much oil has some problems too. People worry that if there is a shortage of oil, it will make farming more expensive and harder to do.
And then we'll just briefly go over a couple of different methods. So there is pastoralism. Pastoralism is when people take care of animals like cows, sheep, and goats. In nomadic pastoralism, people move the animals around to find food, water, and places to rest. This type of farming is done in dry areas like the Sahara Desert, some parts of Central Asia, and India. There's shifting cultivation. In shifting cultivation, farmers clear a small area of forest by cutting down trees and burning them. They use the land to grow crops for a few years until the soil becomes poor and can't grow crops anymore. Then they choose another piece of land and start again. This type of farming is mainly done in places with a lot of rain where the forest can grow back quickly. It's done in places like Northeast India, Southeast Asia, and the Amazon rainforest. There's subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is when people grow just enough food for their family or their village, but not enough to sell or trade. This type of farming is very common in Asia, and about 2.5 billion people did it in 2018. They farm about 60% of all the land that can be used for growing crops. There's intensive farming. Intensive farming is when farmers try to grow as much food as possible. They use a lot of things like water, fertilizer, pesticides, and machines to help, and this type of farming is mostly done in rich countries. And then there's also other methods, and some methods that we'll be going over in this series include hydroponic and organic. So we'll be going over those next. And as always, you can leave a comment below if you have any topic ideas you want to hear us go over in future episodes.
You can reach out to us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok, and we also occasionally live stream on Twitch. So follow us there to see when we do.
And don't forget to give this video a like, as well as follow or subscribe to our other social media accounts and turn on notifications so that you get notified when our content comes out. Otherwise, we will see you all in the next video.